Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just sort of wanted to follow up talking about this book in more detail because I think it's one that I kind of want to capture sort of more of my thoughts on before before I forget, because I'm forgetful. But it's I don't know why I'm leading in. You know what book this is because you've seen the title of the video. The Extinction of Irena by Jennifer Croft, a book that I just think is absolutely wonderful, and I have so many thoughts about it. And I covered a bit of it in my weekly wrap up, but kind of wanted to focus in really specifically on this book because I think there's so much at the heart of it. And I think particularly, I just think this book is just an incredibly clever use of various forms of narrative to have a wider conversation about something else. There will be some spoilers later in the video. I'll try and keep it as spoiler free as possible. But let's get talking a little bit about this book. So the core idea of this book is that there is a well-known author from Poland called Irena which is not her sort of birth name, but kind of in some ways a bit of an adaptation of her real name, her kind of government name, into kind of a pen name. And she is this Polish author who writes about these kind of really incredible topics, is seen as a potential frontrunner for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and lives sort of by a forest. She sort of built her own house right on the sort of border of a forest and kind of communes with it in that sense. And obviously at first this immediately starts to throw up comparisons to the author Olga Tokarczuk, who Jennifer Croft is a translator for into English. And so, you know, a few of the books that Olga Tokarczuk, Nobel Prize winning author, has had translated into English have been through Jennifer Croft. And so she's obviously very familiar with her work, and there's kind of a natural connection. And the book kind of nods at this in a sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of tongue-in-cheek way. And we even get a direct reference to Olga at one point. But we are told that these are different authors. And I think this is more Jennifer Croft playing with the fact that this author has this kind of comparison in a really interesting way, I think. And so the core idea of this book then is that Irena has around her a set of translators who she's often handpicked in some capacity. She's either chosen them directly and made them come and work with her, or they are working for her in some capacity and she has given them a contract, which means that they can only translate her. And in fact, the book several times references this sort of understanding or this kind of contract that they can only translate Irena work, and the only other two Polish authors who they are allowed to translate into their languages are these sort of two authors that are very much beloved by Irena. She is also not allowed. She also says that they are impossible to translate. So she's sort of said in some ways that the only real person the only real author they can translate is her. And what I think is really interesting in this book is that immediately sets up this kind of very odd power dynamic where these translators, I think it's about 8 or 10 of them, are really reliant on Irena for her her work. And it basically sets up this very odd dynamic where from the beginning, they basically all live together in this house, this sort of this place by the woods, just translating her work. And so it becomes this very odd kind of structure of almost the kind of queen at the top, this kind of queen bee, and the rest of them just sort of working around her, trying to do what they can. And at first, they don't actually know each other's names. They are referred to throughout the book in just by specific languages that they translate into. So, for example, there will be English and there will be German, and they are people, but they are just given that name for the first little bit of the book. And the book really plays with that idea that they are sort of depersonalized. They're in some ways in kind of a cult where, you know, they are only allowed to talk to each other in Polish. They're not allowed to talk to each other in any other languages. When they communicate with each other in Polish, there's then a sense that they almost only really ever talk about work. And so as a result, Irena kind of keeps this this kind of godlike power over them throughout everything. But what I think kind of pushes this book along further and does some really clever things is the way it then plays with perspective. So we're told right at the beginning of this book that this book that we're receiving is a translation by the person who we formerly know at the beginning of the book as English, and we later learn is called Alexis. And she is Irena Ray's translator from Polish into English. This book, however, is told, the original novel that is referenced in the book is told by Spanish. And so we learn through, I think her name is Emmy, that we learn everything that happens in this book through this character with the English translator's notes, with Alexis's notes in the footnotes, occasionally saying things like, okay, so this is not actually true, or that didn't really happen, or that's a bit personal. And we're told in the intro to this book from the translator, the note from the translator is basically saying, yeah, so she and I don't necessarily see eye to eye, and it's quite a weird job for me because I get referenced many times throughout this book. And when I am referenced, it's often not particularly fairly. This woman does not like me, basically. And we see that play out through the book. And those footnotes are often hilarious because what they will, for example, in the story itself, the character will say, oh, well, of course, Alexis, or English, said this thing and she was really huffy. And the note will be like, I didn't quite huff this, that's a bit unfair. And at one point just straight up says F you to her as well. It's great. But actually that narrative itself opens up a really clever conversation, because this book then gets to really play around with this idea of who tells the story best, the narrator or the original author. And what does it mean to be the original author in anything? And actually, this is where I think the book really gets into some very fun and meaty discussion. Jennifer Croft, as a translator, is uniquely positioned, and somebody who's written her own novel, not only here, but her book, Homegoing, I think it is, really plays around with this idea, because she is uniquely positioned as a translator to talk about what it is like to be a translator. But equally, she has written a novel in which she is playing a translator, translating a translator of a novel, writing a novel. And it's really clever and sort of silly as a result at times, but really well done, because it starts opening up this idea of what can we actually trust as the perspective. Because if, and we learn a little bit more about this Polish author later, if the Polish author herself is this figure and certain people have certain ways of looking at her, does that change what the translation does? So for example, if you treat the Polish author Irena Ray as this godlike figure, do you translate her work with a different style, this kind of style of reverence, as opposed to if you were writing as, you were translating her work as somebody who thought that she was, something different? And then it also opens up this idea of, if you are translating somebody else's translation and using that as a bridge language, what does that mean for the original? So at one point, without any spoilers, a book is translated from Polish into English, then the English is used as the sort of central version for some people to then translate out from. Does that change things if you've now got two levels of translation? What is the original now? Because the original Polish, is it the English version that you're now translating from? And what does that mean? And so I think this book starts throwing up some really interesting ideas, particularly at the kind of big plot crux point, which is that, which it happens really early on, so don't worry, which is that Irena Ray goes missing. And this opens up a wider conversation then about what to do when not only your kind of cult figure, your kind of boss, your kind of godlike queen figure is not there. What does that suddenly mean for all of these people who idolize her? There's suddenly a power vacuum and there's suddenly competition. And this sets up a lot of the disagreements between Spanish and English in this book. I mean, it's worth noting as well, the kind of tongue-in-cheek thing is that Jennifer Croft herself also translates from Argentinian Spanish. And so she is also somebody who could, in theory, play the other character in this book if they were cast in real life. I'm going to go into some spoilers in just a moment. So just advance warning that if you need to start dropping off at this point, please do go for it. What I will say before that spoiler curtain is that I think this book is incredible, if you couldn't tell already from how much I love this. I think it's just really well done, of just being an incredibly clever and fun book that deals with some really interesting discussions in a very accessible way, and is also just good fun and a good way of looking at it, regardless, told by somebody who is in many ways the perfect person to tell this kind of story. So yeah, I really, really highly recommend this. With the spoilers now coming into effect, what I will start to say is what this then does in terms of the plot. So as I mentioned, she is somebody who, Irena Ray is this author who goes missing. And in the meantime, they start to fight, the translators band together to try and work out what the rest of her work was like, because now they've got a vacuum. They're not allowed to translate anybody else. We're told that there's this arch nemesis, Barbara Bonk, again, perfect name. And Barbara Bonk is this sort of writer who, apparently there's this great deal of animosity between Irena Ray and Barbara. And she sort of appears as sort of really grand dame kind of figure who I found hilarious. She's just this sort of slightly ridiculous character who some of them love, some of them seem to really dislike. And again, part of that dislike is that she's Irena Ray's rival. So, or kind of antagonist almost. And so some of these translators, particularly the ones who hold her in the highest, who hold Irena Ray in the highest regard, immediately dislike Barbara Bonk, because they're like, well, she is our queen's enemy, so she's our enemy. And it just sort of gets more and more absurd from that. But there is this masterpiece that's held over Irena Ray's head, and this idea of actually she's almost one masterpiece away from winning the Nobel, and her name is always in the ring. We're told that Olga Tokarczuk has won the Nobel, and we're sort of told that there's this sort of it's gonna come soon. And we're also told through the way the narrative is told at one point very clearly that it's already happened. As in, like, we know it's coming. It's just when are we going to get to that point in the novel? We're not there yet, but it's a fact that at the time this book, The Extinction of Irena Ray, is written in Spanish and then translated, she's already won the Nobel. But at the time of the events in the book, it hasn't happened. And this then sort of throws into the kind of conversation this really interesting discussion about idolizing authors or idolizing certain people, because in her absence, what do these people do? They're all beholden to her in some ways for not only their careers, but seemingly for a lot of them, their sense of purpose in life. And so taking that a step further, the book then really explores what they do when she's not there. And what starts to happen is a translation of a piece of her work. This is believed to be her magnum opus. This is a 900-page book. Again, a playful reference, I think, to Olga Tokarczuk, whose books of Jacob was about 900 pages, at least in the version I read, and was considered her magnum opus and was seen as a big reason for why she won the Nobel. And so this kind of all plays into this sort of meta-narrative thing going on, with also engaging with Jennifer Croft, the real-life author and translator now, and her knowledge and her interactions with authors. But we're told that, Alexis, the English, who's known as English, the English translator, starts to translate parts of this magnum opus into English. And this suddenly becomes seen as the predominant narrative. This is the main one from which other translations will later be made, skipping some of the other steps, which really annoys Spanish, Emmy in the book. And it starts to really play around with this idea in a really interesting way, because what we start to see is how that narrative grows, and it suddenly sets people against each other, because if you've got a power vacuum with Irena Ray at the top as your god or your queen, if somebody is now second to them and everybody else is still below, there is utter competition for everyone to fight to get there. And it just kind of keeps moving with this idea of translating a work and what it now means to have something translated, what it means for that work to be in English, and the kind of scandal that goes around some of that as well. And without, again, this is absolutely in the spoiler territory, the ending of this book, I think, is genius for that. And again, if you need to drop off here, please do. The ending of this book really plays with this idea a lot, because what we later find out is that Irena Ray seemingly is still missing and is presumed dead. And the book, the Nobel, is basically awarded to her being in hiding, when actually it's believed she's just dead, or definitely missing. So actually, what that then sets into motion, if when you sort of process the end of the book, is realizing that the translators have done all of the work in finishing a novel that was originally in Polish, and finishing it so that the English version, and Polish version, I think to some extent, are finished and complete and seen as a piece of work, which are then lauded as this incredible piece of work that gets Irena the Nobel, or is at least part of it. But then actually, who is the author suddenly? Because if Irena had written 80-90% of it and then had it finished by somebody else, well, clearly she's the genius and she did all the work and it's, it's her thing. But if a lot of that work has been done by the translators who thought it was genius, but then also were trying to finish it off and pull it together and then have translated it, is it really the translator's work instead? There's sort of often a thing about translators being viewed as novelists or writers in their own right, that they haven't just moved something from A to B, they've also crafted a book, they've done something really clever. And I, two books that I can think of off the top of my head that really show this really well are The Birthday Party by Laurent Mauvignier and translated by Daniel Lekin, or I'll double check his exact name, and also Daisy Rockwell's translation of Gitanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand, both of which are so creative as pieces of writing, not only in presumably the original, I've not read the original language in either one of them, but the English translation, there's so much that's complex with the language that's going on that it's impossible to think of the author, the translators, as having only moved something from one language to another. They would have had to have created a whole system for making that work. So in Tomb of Sand, that's this very kind of sing-songy, playful, chattery kind of conversation that goes through the book. In The Birthday Party, it's this real rhythm that is created through the length and pacing of sentences that really does a lot for the tension in the narrative. And so between them, those two books have done something really quite special, not only in the original, but the translators have also done some incredible work that bears sort of acknowledgement. And I think this book really plays with that idea that actually, if a translator has finished a piece of work and has kind of contributed original ideas to it, would we only see it as this person's work? The translators in this book aren't the ones winning the Nobel. It's Irena, but Irena at this point in the book doesn't really exist. And so the translators have won, but Irena's name is the one that goes down in history. And I think this is a really interesting way then of examining exactly that kind of conversation around translation in just such an interesting and accessible way. Anyway, as you can tell by the fact this video is almost 20 minutes long, I bloody love this book. I think this book is really well done, incredibly clever and perceptive and playful and great in many, many ways. And also just opens up these much broader conversations about narrative, about translation, about ownership and authorship, about kind of what is the predominant narrative in terms of English being the kind of the main language that most things are translated into, first and foremost above almost any other language. I just think it's brilliant and clever in so many ways. And I really take my hat off to Jennifer Croft for crafting something so elaborate and clever and thoughtful. Yeah, I think this is a bloody brilliant book and it deserves to be on every prize list, I think, this year.